The University of Regina has a lot of nice litho stones in our litho studio, and today we are going to grain a stone and prep it to receive drawing. The first thing we need to do is to select a stone. Litho stones are heavy, so if you feel comfortable carrying it, you can certainly do that. Be careful of your knees and your back. Take your stone and place it in the graining sink. Now, alternately, you can make use of our lift. Here I'm demonstrating the use of the lift as it pushes the platform up, and squeezing the handle lowers it. When using the lift, you want the platform as close to the shelf and stone as possible. Jack the platform up to the appropriate height, and then carefully maneuver the stone out of its resting place onto the platform. Lay it down flat and bring it to the graining sink or the work table. Over short distances like that, you can leave the platform up and maneuver the stone in the workspace. So here I've jacked it up a little higher in order to meet the surface of the graining station, and then gently slide the stone mostly into place. And then here I let the pressure off slightly, leaving a majority of the weight on the sink itself. Now I move the platform out of the way and store it for use later. It should be really obvious which side is the printing side and which side is the back side. And no, we don't grain down the back side. We only ever use one printing surface. So to remove the old drawing, we have to sand the stones down in a sense, using a variety of different sized grits. So the first thing I do is I put on a rubber apron and I wet the surface of my stone. Reaching for the 50 grit, the smallest number actually means the largest particles. I'm going to sprinkle a liberal amount on the surface of my stone. Think of this as the gritty part of sandpaper without the paper attached. And keep in mind you must have a wet stone in order to do this. And now the part of the process that scares people the most, and that's the use of the levigator. The levigator is this really heavy steel disc with a handle on top. It can look really graceful as it skims across the surface of the stone, removing the old drawing. But it's kind of an awkward motion, and so we're going to watch it several times here in the video so you get a sense of what you're in for. This is in real time. I haven't sped it up, and I'm not going to slow it down either. At least for this first graining, you're going to watch an entire round of graining. That is, wet the stone, apply your grit, and move the levigator up and down, side to side, back and forth, middle, top, bottom, left side, right side, trying to hit every aspect of the stone as evenly as possible while spinning the levigator around. You don't have to go fast. You can go relatively slow until you get the hang of it. And honestly, for some people, they never really get the hang of it. But in any event, we keep spinning around, and you'll note that the surface of the stone now looks kind of light gray. You don't see any of the original grit, and that's because most of that original grit is spent. So that was a round. I've now moved my levigator off to the side, leaning the handle on that piece of wood, and then very gently, with a little bit of water, I'm going to rinse all of that leftover sanded off stone from the surface. Typically, I don't want to touch my stone with my bare hands, but because my hands are clean and because there's a film of water there, I'm able to do that. Lithography is predicated on the whole idea that grease and water don't get along, and so we don't ever want to introduce grease onto our stone surface by accident. But again, we're pretty safe here. So I've just completed my first round with the 50 grit, and I'm going to do it all over again with the 50 grit. There's a sign just above the sink that'll tell you how many times you need to do this and in different grits. But we're going to do 2, and we're going to do it just like the first round. It's a little less satisfying because the image is mostly gone, if not entirely gone by this point. But we need to grain the stone for 2, maybe 3 minutes until it gets to the point, again, where it's turned light gray, and it will actually feel a little stickier. You'll feel some suction. At that point, you'll know you'll have exhausted the grit. You can move your levigator carefully to the side and rinse. After having done 2 full rounds of 50 grit, you're going to take the rubber squeegee and remove the excess water from the surface of the stone. What we're doing next is checking the level of the stone. Most of these stones are pretty level. They've been used a lot over the years, but they can get out of whack. So it's important that we check the level before we continue polishing. Now you'll note that the stone just changed color there, and that's because I'm using a fan to dry it. Let's have a look at the fan. The Litho Fan is one in a long list of strange, esoteric printmaking tools. It's exceedingly simple. It's a stick with a piece of kind of plastic on the end that we spin around and we use to dry our stones. There may be other ways to do this, but this is the traditional way. If you find it's too awkward holding the fan by the end, you can move a little closer to the blade. With our stone now dry, after 2 rounds of the 50 grit, we take the metal straight edge and some little strips of bond paper. This is just computer paper cut into strips, and we lay the straight edge from end to end, placing the piece of paper at 3 different spots: middle, left side, and right side. What we're looking for is the paper to remain stuck everywhere we place it. Here I'm going to go diagonally. I'll start in the middle, I'll do one end and then the other. And I test over and over again on this stone, looking to see if the paper slips. If the paper doesn't slip, the stone is pretty level. But if the paper does slip, if you're able to pull it out without much effort, you have an inconsistency in the surface that typically you're going to need to remedy in the subsequent rounds of 50. You're not done with the 50 yet, regardless of what happens. So it looks like we're getting lucky with the stone. It's pretty level everywhere we check it. But let's talk about what happens if we have a low point in the middle. If that's the case, on our subsequent rounds of 50, we might need to spend a little bit more time going around the edge of the stone. Of course, we want to hit the whole stone, but we want to go around the edge. And in the event that we have a hump in the middle, it's the opposite. We're going to spend a little bit more time graining in the middle. You keep going, and after 2 more rounds, dry your stone again and check for level. Assuming that the stone is level, you complete the required rounds of 50, and then you can move on to higher grits. Let's get in a little closer and look at the action of the levigator one more time. So, stone is wet with water, and then we're going to apply our grit. Sometimes we call this carborundum. This is number 50, so again, the first one we start with and the coarsest of the material. This does most of the work of removing the old image. It grains down the surface of the stone, physically removing a very, very small amount, but removing it nonetheless. You'll note that when I get started graining, I have my right hand on the handle and I spin one of those little holes with my left hand to help me get started. And while I put away the levigator here and rinse off the stone, I want to talk quickly about safety. Safety as it relates to using the levigator. It's a big, heavy thing, and you can feel a little out of control when you're using it for the first time. What you need to remember are the following. If you feel like you're going too fast, stop spinning. And if you feel like it's going to come off of the stone, don't catch it. Just stop spinning. And in a worst case scenario, jump out of the way. I would much rather that this thing hits the floor than your foot. Okay, so back to preparing for the next round of grits. You always have to rinse the stone and the levigator between rounds, but it's really important that you're extremely careful in doing this when you're moving between grits. So we were just using the 50 and we are about to go to a much finer grit. It's important that we rinse the underside of the levigator as well as the top and the handle. If there's any little bits of that 50 laying around and they show up on the stone while we're sanding with something finer, it will leave a scratch. We really want to avoid those. So take your time and, like always with stone litho, watch your fingers. With everything rinsed thoroughly, including the surface of the stone is wet, I'm going to move to the 100 grit. You'll note that it looks different than the 50. It's much finer and it tends to move around on the surface of the water a little bit more. You'll also notice a difference when you begin graining. It doesn't feel nearly as resistant as the 50, and that's because the 100 and the subsequent grits afterwards are simply polishing the stone. They're not removing large portions of the surface. But of course, the same rules apply when levigating. You're going to spin round and round for 2 or 3 minutes, and you'll note the difference in the surface texture of the grit on the stone once it's more or less exhausted. You should also feel a different sort of suction on the levigator itself. Once you get to that point, you'll carefully move the levigator off to the side, rinse the surface of the stone and the levigator, and repeat for a total of 3 times. Rinse carefully and move on to 180 and 220 for 3 rounds each. So after your workout, you can rinse and then wipe the bottom of the levigator with a brown paper towel. It doesn't have to be perfect, but removing large amounts of water helps to keep some of the rust at bay. Now, if you have any energy left, we are going to put a border around the surface of our stone. We need a little piece of red Conte. We need gum arabic in the jug, as well as a brush and a small bowl. My freshly grained stone has been carefully moved to the work table. And using a ruler, I'm going to put a 1-inch border all the way around my stone. The Conte doesn't affect the stone in any way. It's not greasy. However, I want to be careful that there's no grease on the ruler or on my hands. So once we've traced out the border, we're going to take our bowl and a small amount of gum arabic in our brush, and we're going to paint a thin coating of this gum arabic around the edge of the stone, leaving the middle of the stone itself clean and untouched for drawing. The reason that we're placing a border in the first place on the stone is because typically we don't print off the edges of the stone. The edges of the stone can chip, the edges of the stone could potentially break, and they are notorious for collecting unwanted ink while we're printing. Here's a close-up. You'll see that there's a relatively high degree of surface tension on gum arabic, so it doesn't go all over the place. You can paint it on and keep it more or less where you want it. It doesn't need to be super thick, and in fact, if it's really thick, it can sometimes cause trouble in the processing steps later. So you paint it on pretty thin, back and forth, and you go as slow as you're comfortable going. Gum arabic is really central to the stone lithographic process. It desensitizes the stone. That is, it kind of protects it so that it's less likely to collect grease and ink during the printing process. But we'll talk more about that when it comes time to drawing on a stone and etching a stone. For now, what you need to know is that the gum arabic border protects the stone and will make your printing process later go a little bit smoother. If you have any extra gum, at this stage it can go back into the jug and be put away. Before we move on, we need to make sure that our gum coating is dry so we can use our fan or just let it sit for an hour. In the meantime, with warm water, we can clean our bowl and our brush and put both of those things away. In order to keep your stone clean, ensure that it doesn't get dirty or wet. Fashion a basic cover, put your name on it, and store your stone either on the work table or back in one of the shelves. Oh, don't forget to put a piece of tape on the side of your stone with your name and the semester you're working.